Not that I was particularly rebellious. When you grow up in a small provincial town like Alostar and attend a convent school, rebellion was just not in your vocabulary. I heard about girls who smoked, had boyfriends, and even got pregnant, but they were so rare that they were a novelty. If teenagehood was a time for us to find our identities, I spent a lot of mine being a scowling grump, constantly finding faults with mom, shrugging off her attempts to have women-to-women moments. I suppose daughters rarely think of their mothers as cool, and as teenagers instinctively push away from them because they don't want to be like them. When we were young, we only see the characteristics of our mothers that we don't like. It is only later, perhaps when we become mothers ourselves, that we finally appreciate our mother's virtues, those we hope we inherit. When I get annoyed with my own daughters, I will mutter under my breath, "Wait until you have daughters." And then catch myself wondering if mom ever thought the same thing too when I was young.
Brilliant. So Marina thought her mother was a tyrant, the rest of the nation thought her father was. He's denied it, he's very snarky. He's never confronted with the question of him being a dictator. Okay, next passage is from page 39, when Marina is sent off to high school in the United States, right?
Yes.
Yes, so we'll read a bit about that because it also, there's a little section where it reflects on your father's response to you.
Yeah. My father, both my parents thought that travel is educational. And so, just to follow up to this, that we hosted an American student in our home for one summer, and our families became good friends. So my dad thought that it would be very good for me to go and spend time with an American family in California. For all his horizon-broadening expectations for me in California, I doubt if my father could have imagined what Miralles High School would be like. I was excited to go to the school and had expected that my new schoolmates would greet me like my St. Nicholas schoolmates had greeted Lauren. And Lauren was the girl we hosted. I assumed they would want to know all about life in Malaysia, half a globe away from their shiny city by the ocean. But I had not counted on almost complete disinterest. Perhaps the diversity of America made a little foreigner like me invisible.
As well, but we're not going to go to the win. We're going to that moment when he decides to get active and to play a part in the election.
It had not occurred to me until then that he was planning to stand for elections again. But as he talked about Najib possibly calling for elections soon, and how Pakatan Harapan, the Alliance of Hope that his party had joined, needed to really go all out to win some seats, there was no mistaking the hints he was dropping. I stared at him as if he had just told me he was going to climb Mount Everest. Who on earth stands for elected office at age 92? It was the most bizarre thing I'd ever heard of. But I should not have been surprised. Dad may have been in his 10th decade, but he was fit and healthy, with an upright back and a full head of hair. Most importantly, his mind was clear and lucid, and nothing invigorates him more than a fight. A desirable prospect for them, the latter, they knew, wasn't enough for him.
Okay, so the book then traces the fall of that government. It lasted 22 months. We just came out of an election a couple of months ago. Your father stood for election again. And as you noted at dinner recently, he lost. And he lost quite dramatically, losing his deposit. So that's a question we can come to, but that's a political question. And I think you're open to that, right? Some political questions. Okay. So, like your father, who's deeply political, say he loves a fight. You are also deeply political, I know for a fact. Okay. So, at this point, just show of hands, if anybody would like to make a comment or a question, so we know where you want this conversation to go.
About what it is like to grow up with a parent whose politics you don't, as you grow up, that you don't approve of, right? So I can see, from what I hear, that you try to distance yourself from your father's politics. But was there ever anything that he did that made you intensely dislike him?
I wrote a newspaper column for 30 years, and I wrote about a lot of things that I saw that was not right with the government. I was working in HIV/AIDS. I talked about women's rights. I talked about freedom of the media, freedom of expression, all sorts of things. And people saw this very clearly, that my dad would say one thing and I'd be doing something, I'd be saying something else. But actually, I never wrote thinking of what he would think. I just wrote what I felt in my column. And the fact was that it seemed to have resonated with a lot of people, and people would come up and tell me that, yeah, so that was a point that I tried to make. So there was never any public dissent from me, except when people speculated.
Did that open you up to charges of hypocrisy?
Always. People thought I was, even when I published this book, before some people even read it, they assumed that it must be whitewashing my dad's reputation, which if they read it, really, they would know that it isn't.
I can't help but recall the International Conference on AIDS in Asia Pacific, which was back in the late 1990s, where you were the key person, and you had a transgender emceeing, and your father actually came to that and opened it. So we were all wondering, how does your father reconcile himself to all these alternate sexualities and this whole discourse around HIV and alternate sexualities? I think you also had a great influence on him, whether you admit it or not.
Yeah, I was chair of this Asia Pacific AIDS conference in 1999, and he was coming to open it, and our principle was that every event there, including the opening ceremony, was a platform for advocacy for HIV/AIDS, and I was also clear that we needed to be as inclusive as possible, include as many of the communities most affected by HIV in every event, including the opening ceremony, because it's so high profile. So we had the idea that the person to introduce my dad to make his speech was going to be a trans woman. And well, I do that often. I hijack and I present a fait accompli, and what was he going to do? He's introduced and he has to go up there and speak. But he never said anything to me afterwards, I must say.
Maria Mathe's father, on the other hand, I believe is a man who needs no introduction in Bangladesh. If my experiences over the last week or so, anything to go by, many people know him, they know his name. Is there something about the psychology of children of famous men or women?
I think for Penguin, the psychology was just to sell books, really. We had a name, we need a name, so we'll sell a book. I think they started with me because they knew that I wrote. I've been writing a newspaper column for, I think, 30 years. That's telling. And so they approached me first. And I don't know of any other children of, heads of government who also write. So I guess, I was an easy target in a way.
series might come to a
you
stop,
might come
right?
to a dead stop, for
Right.
all I know. I don't know.
Many of the, I myself struggle to figure out who in Southeast Asia, Sukarno Megawati became president of the republic.
Yes.
And recently Marcos's son has become president again, right? So they get into power, not necessarily into non-fiction and writing. So that I think also makes you kind of unique.
For me and my dad, there was no way that I could leave my mother out of this, because obviously I'm made from two people and not just one. So I have a whole chapter that's just entitled Mom, which I'd like to read from. So hope it's not too long. No story about Dad can include Mom. They are a team.